Florence Farringer with your WSLR News headlines for May 28th, 2024. The fate of 3 historic warm mineral spring structures will be discussed today at a Northport City Commission meeting. The 3 structures belong to the National Register of Historic Places and include one of 3 cycloramas still standing in the United States. The buildings were ravaged by Hurricane Ian, and all attempts to restore the buildings have since floundered. The most recent proposal for a public-private cooperation failed after the private developer pulled out due to a lack of sufficient economic incentive. In March, the City Commission voted to remove the buildings and replace them with a modern minimalistic building. But the public of Northport is largely opposed to the razing of the historic landmarks. This new proposal, which would likely reverse their March decision to raze and replace the buildings, seeks to create another public-private partnership where in exchange for helping restore these 3 buildings on a 20-acre lot of warm mineral springs, the developer would be allowed to develop 60 acres of neighboring land. Linda Figg, owner of 9 construction companies, is suing to try and get around the consequences of her company's fatal actions. The relevant federal agency has asked the judge to dismiss her case on the basis that they have yet to actually follow through on dishing out these consequences. In 2018, a pedestrian bridge collapsed in Miami, fatally crushing 5 motorists and 1 construction worker. The bridge was built for the Florida International University, funded by federal grants, and built by Linda Figg's construction companies. The federal agency found that these companies' shoddy engineering was the primary culprit for the bridge's collapse, rendering these 6 deaths entirely preventable. As a result, the federal agency debarred the companies from receiving federal grants. Figg attempted to circumvent this debarment by creating affiliate corporate entities and asking for federal funding indirectly. The federal agency discovered this and is currently in the process of considering debarring these affiliate companies. Figg beat them to the chase with her lawsuit, which the agency is now calling premature, though it clarified in its motion for dismissal that should it decide to debar the companies, it would be completely within its rights to do so. This has been Florence Farringer with your WSLR News headlines for May 28th, 2024.
You are listening to WSLR LP 96.5 FM in Sarasota.
This is show 37 of our Changing Environment and is being recorded on May 28th, 2024. The previous show was Corduroy, hosted by Sebastian.
I'm Julie Morris.
I'm John O'Miller, and we are assisted today by Alvaro Montalegre.
Our guest today is Dr. Uzi Baram. He is an emeritus professor, recently retired from New College of Florida. He is the president of UBHeritage, LLC. He practices public archaeology to engage the local community in the heritage of this region. He established the Public Archaeology Lab at New College and participated in the team Looking for Angola, a maroon community on the Manatee River. He is also active in the movement to protect and document archaeology threatened by rising sea level.
The views, comments, and opinions that come from our interviews, shows, on-air personalities, and from our calling guests are uncensored, and those views and opinions can be widespread and extremely diverse. The opinions or views expressed by same do not necessarily reflect the views or opinions of WSLR, our staff, or volunteers.
Uzi, it's great to have you with us in the studio today, and there's so many things we want to talk about our heritage, and we thought maybe we would start with Warm Mineral Springs and Little Salt Springs.
Good morning, and thank you for having me here. Both John and Julie, I really want to say I appreciate all the work you've done over the years, decades, on the environment, and I really appreciate that you want to incorporate cultural heritage into that work. And so, we start with what we have here in Sarasota County, which is a really impressive set of archaeological evidence. I want to just start that when I think about the history of this region, there's kind of three strands to always consider. One is, and what we'll focus on, is the archaeological evidence. Second is the indigenous knowledge of what's here. And then there's kind of what I refer to as local knowledge, kind of what the folks who grew up here, think about this place, come up with. And when I was teaching at New College, when I engage in my public archaeology, it's always three strands. We want to think hard and listen carefully to the indigenous views. And for the Seminole tribe of Florida, the view comes from the 19th century leader Wildcat, who says the Seminoles come from the sands of Florida. The local knowledge, hopefully we'll explore a little bit, tends to muffle the history and frankly confuse it a bit. The archaeological evidence is actually fantastic. And I spent a good part of the last few decades trying to raise the profile. And we can start with some of the earliest evidence in North America for Native Americans, for the indigenous people. And it comes from Northport in two springs, Little Salt Spring and More Mineral Springs. Those two springs contain evidence that goes back more than 14,000 years of ancient peoples, the ancestral Seminole, who were living on this land. And by the luck of archaeology, the material remains of the activities have been preserved, found, excavated, and analyzed. And we have a really clear sense of the robust, meaningful lives that these people had over 14,000 years ago on this very land.
So War Mineral Springs, when sea level was lower and areas were drier, you had to climb down into a ledge, and that's where they find these 14,000-year-old remains. Is that correct?
Yeah, as we think about rising sea levels, right, we know it's been accelerating. We also know, and I think it does in the politics of climate change, add some complexity. This isn't the first time in the planet's history that sea levels have changed. When we go back 20, 40,000 years, the sea levels were lower. So sitting here in Sarasota, what's now the coastline is about 50 miles from where the coastline was way back then. And these sinkholes, the water level was much lower. So right now, for both Little Salt Spring and Warm Mineral Springs, the water level is right at the ground surface. But 14,000 years ago, it was much lower. And as you point out, there was ledges and there was a funnel-shaped area. And the people used those. When we think about those springs, they were basically oases because the coast was 50 miles away on the west side, further on the east side. And large mammals would come to get that water, and humans would use that as the opportunity to hunt as well as to gather, and things would fall in the water. And they were ultimately found by archaeologists, recovered, and thanks to work with the indigenous people, interpreted. So we understand that way of life. As sea levels rose on the coast, they also rose in the springs. And I think as we think about what's happening around this peninsula, I think most of us are aware of the changes of the coast, but the aquifer is also rising. And so we deal with a crisis that's water coming from the seas, from under the ground, and of course more intense rain from the skies.
So the archaeology in Warm Mineral Springs, those investigations were all underwater.
Correct. That these were terrestrial sites back 14,000 years ago, and now they're underwater. And in fact, there's another site off of Minnesota Key with
yeah, let's talk about that.
That's also that one got
wait. Not so fast.
There's a lot to cover with the history of the ancient people.
Let me put it this way: if Warm Mineral Springs site and Little Salt Springs site were being discovered for the first time today, we could have gained a lot more information. We lost a lot of information in the way in which it was initially explored. Is that fair?
Yeah, I mean, when I teach on archaeology, when I think about archaeological practice, I don't defend previous generations. I don't insult them, but I also don't defend them. One of the really amazing things from Warm Mineral Spring, back in the 1950s, there was a kind of famous character living in this region, a retired military officer who liked going diving and liked to ride sharks. In fact, that's the name of his title of his autobiography, The Man Who Rode Sharks. And he took it upon himself to find places to dive, and he dove into Warm Mineral Springs and mucked around, is the only way I can really say it, and found human remains. Now, part of, I think it's important what you raised, Jono, is at the time it wasn't believed that ancient people were here. And so Bill Royal was arguing, yes, it was. He was joined with Jeannie Clark, the founder of Moat Marine, and they pushed it forward. They got press attention, ultimately getting the state archaeologist to look at the material and confirm that, in fact, it was very old. An archaeologist at the University of Miami did the work at Little Salt Spring. That's John Gifford, who has since passed away. His close colleague, Steve Koski, is the Sarasota County archaeologist. And they were able, over the decades, to piece together the story to show that, in fact, yes, these are ancient remains going back, again, as I said, at least 14,000 years. I would say there's probably deeper time that just hasn't been found yet.
So when we were students, Sonny Cockrell was of the opinion that they were 20,000 years old. So they've been dialed back a little?
I think one of the things that we've been wrestling with, again, is the kind of local knowledge that still kind of confuses how long people were here.
Yeah.
The archaeological evidence, which needs to be verified in terms of very scientific protocols, and then the indigenous knowledge that goes back further. Because most of the people who lived during those ancient times probably were relatively close to the coast, and that coast is now underwater.
Right.
It's several projects, including one out of the Florida State University, has found ancient remains in underwater.
Okay.
Right. So these are all terrestrial sites that are now underwater, and as someone who's only done terrestrial work, it's hard enough to excavate when you're on the ground. I respect my underwater archaeology colleagues a lot because the challenges are just tremendous to do that work well.
Well, I know we have listeners in Northport, and
Yes.
I just want to say, with these issues coming up about what's going to happen to Warm Mineral Springs, and Uzi, correct me if you think I'm off here, but if you were to make a list of the 10 most significant archaeological sites in the state, the 10 most significant paleontological sites, fossils, the 10 most interesting geological sites in the state, and the 10 most interesting hydrological sites, Warm Mineral Springs would probably be on all four lists.
Without any question that in Northport we have some of the most important places in North America.
Right.
And I'll say that in the discussions that are ongoing right now about the historic buildings, I'm concerned that I'm not hearing about preserving those springs. Because while, of course, it's an important place for people to, quote, take the waters as a spa, I hope people know that it's also a cemetery. And there's a need to understand that there are archaic period burials there. And one of the pieces of the puzzle that needs to be fronted, and again, I think local institutions have been shying away from it inappropriately. I'm an American by choice. Right? I chose to be an American citizen. I pay attention to the Constitution, which recognizes the sovereignty of Native Americans. In 1990, a law, the Native American Graves Protection Repatriation Act, gave Native American tribes control over their ancestral remains. That was more than 3 decades ago. While tens of thousands of ancestors have been released by museums and universities to their descendants, there's still so many that haven't. And last January, the Biden administration strengthened that law that allows, for the first time, indigenous knowledge to be part of the discussions. And frankly, some museums are really scared by that because the Seminoles know their history. And it's important, I think, hopefully everyone agrees that when people are laid to rest, they should be respected and not just kind of forgotten. And the discussion of those historic buildings is important, but any construction is going to affect the geology, the water quality, which means it affects those graves. And there should be a lot more discussion going on with the Tribal Historic Preservation Office of the Seminole Tribe of Florida to ensure that protection is there.
So can we talk about the Manatee Key offshore site?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. You're eager to do that. And that works on several levels to really think about rising sea levels. So and this is the archaeological terminology, right, for the Little Salt Spring, Warm Mineral Springs, it's known as the Paleo-Indian period. That gives way to the Archaic period, a 7,000-year period. And the climate changes. The sea levels are rising. And the people who are living there, the ancestral Seminole, are faced with an interesting quandary. They want their dead to rest in peace. They know the seas are rising because they see it. How do you protect? Well, the answer was ingenious. Bury your dead in freshwater ponds. If they're already underwater, inundation won't be an issue. And it turns out off of Manatee Key, about a quarter mile off the key today, there was a freshwater pond on a small hill. And starting about 8,000 years ago, right? I always wanted people to appreciate how long ago that is, right? Not just to hear the number, but to think that's a long, long time ago. And for at least 1,000 years, those ancient people buried their dead with care and respect underwater in that pond. And the seas rose and rose until they covered up that cemetery. About a decade ago, some boaters were mucking about and found some remains, luckily contacted, as anyone should. When you find anything that's related to ancient remains, contact the state archaeologist. They came in and looked and found that, in fact, it was a large-scale cemetery. And so what we have is some of the evidence for those ancient people. They buried their dead in an ingenious manner, and it worked. The challenge has been over the last few years how to continue the protection, right? And I think one of the kind of wonderful successes is the State Archaeology Office was able to work with residents on Manatee Key who took it upon themselves to kind of keep an eye on that patch of water. And if they see boaters coming by and staying, to call the police and to make sure that no one is disturbing the dead. And I think that's just one of the things that we have a responsibility for. When we hear about land acknowledgements and the rest institutions have been doing over the last 6-7 years, it's a nice little thing to do, but that's not the goal. It's to respect the heritage of the Indigenous people, to understand it clearly in its robust way. And I think all of us hopefully recognize that protecting a cemetery is a good thing to do. And I'm really proud of the people on that key who've just taken that upon themselves to continue to be respectful and sustain it. The state archaeologists, the underwater archaeology takes a while to kind of figure out. The evidence is from about 8,000 years ago to about 7,000 years. And again, think about 1,000 years of being in a place and the amount of knowledge and understanding past generation after generation after generation. Some of that is still within the Seminole Tribe of Florida, the Miccosukee Band of the Indians of Florida.
And so the site that's now underwater off of Manatee Key was a freshwater pond at the top of a hill.
Yes.
7,000 years ago.
8,000 years ago, yeah.
8,000 years ago, okay.
Yeah, and I think it is kind of hard to do the visualization. I think this is one of the things archaeology is actually really helpful to kind of force us to think both for those springs, that somehow an inland spring the water rose, and not just look at the coast, and to recognize that these ancient people understood really well their environment and found a really effective solution. I've actually encouraged you to think about, if you're concerned about your dead, your family members, think about where you're burying them. because the seas are rising. What to do? Well, the ancient people provide a really good answer.
And there are other sites in Florida that had that same technique of burying underwater, right?
Yep. And so part of Little Salt Spring is a slough that has archaic period burials. And on the East Coast at Windover, before the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act was passed, excavations by Florida State University did massive excavations that has uncovered a tremendous amount of information on the people who were buried at Windover. Right? Today, we don't do that without partnership with the Seminole Tribe of Florida in Florida because of this act. But the knowledge that was produced, we don't need to throw out. We just need to think about how we use it, what we use it for. And those finds tell us about people who were kind to each other, the people who had ailments who were cared for their entire life. We find objects buried with people that give us hints about their material world, and we know so much more about the plants and the ecology of the archaic period thanks to those early 1980 excavations.
On the Spot Aid is a 501c3 nonprofit street medicine outreach program, bridging the gap between homelessness and health care. On the Spot Aid provides assessments, treatments, education, and provision of basic first aid supplies in public places where the homeless can be found, serving Port Charlotte and South Sarasota County, Florida. More info is available at onthespotaid.com.
Okay, so what's next after the offshore sites?
It's Mound Street,
Mound Street,
Sarasota, DeSoto National Monument, and the park in Englewood.
Yes, so let's talk. So we're doing a lot of history here, right? And that's the way to see it. It's a lot of history. The sea levels start stabilizing about 6,000 years ago. And what we find archaeologically is people start living on the coast. And we start finding that they are creating villages. And one of the material aspects of those village lives is mounds. As many of you know, listening, there's no stone in this part of Florida. And so what can you build out of? Well, you have several choices. Wood, which doesn't preserve very well. Dirt, which we mostly have sand, so it's hard to build with. Or shell. Shell is plentiful. It's both the shellfish provides food, but the shell itself becomes construction material. And up and down the coast, before Europeans came, were tremendous amounts of both shell mounds as well as some sand mounds. Many were destroyed. We have a sense of the scale of that destruction in the early 20th century because many of them were used as roadbed for the Tamiami Trail. Right? These concentration of shells were seen as opportunities, and then development destroyed even more. But there's still some left. And so we want to think about those mounds. Mound building is a tradition across North America. It just plays out a little differently in subtropic Florida, where it's shell, not dirt, as it is in Ohio, Indiana, and other such Midwestern places, even down into Georgia. And I do want to say, because years ago, I was interviewed by a reporter for the Herald Tribune. I still get kind of ribbed by my friends about it. There's a local myth that was created in the early 20th century by a realtor that Florida is protected, Sarasota in particular, is protected from hurricanes by mounds. And this is as silly as you can get. There's plenty of evidence that the hurricanes have hit us multiple times, including the last few years, Ian being a prominent example, but Irma as well. But I think it's actually a good way to think about this. One, please buy house insurance, because hurricanes do hit here. But also, that's part of the muffling. Right? Instead of actually understanding it as part of history, to create this myth, this silliness, that's how people in the ancient days did something for me, or for us.
Well, they very considerately left this show where we wanted to build roads. So when you go down and turn at Selby Gardens, you're on Mound Street.
There we go.
And but it's hard to see the mound. Now, I want to clarify something. When you say they built mounds along the coast, That's the peninsular coast, not the barrier island coast, right? They were not so much on the barrier islands, am I right?
That is correct. Those barrier islands, I think, and Johnny, you could probably go on about it, were always temporary.
Right.
So they were not meant to stay long, and so they were used as burial sites, but not as habitation sites.
One of my funky facts about our barrier islands is that in 1900, farmland sold for more money per acre than beachfront property on Sanibel.
Yeah.
So it's a relatively recent innovation that people actually wanted to live permanently on barrier islands.
So we think about these mounds. There's been archaeological research on mounds for almost a century or more, and so we do have a sense of how what they are. The different types of mounds, different time periods. Most of what we have remaining comes from a period known as the Minnesota period for Manatee and Sarasota counties, from about 2,500 years ago to 1,300 years ago. But here's also where we have the muffling. So there's a mound down in Englewood, South Sarasota County, Indian Mound Park, archaeologically known as Polson Point Mound. It's a place for boaters to go in. It's a nice entertainment area. It's a beautiful spot to see a sunset. And there's interpretive signs put up by the Sarasota County Historical Resources. And one of the signs in particular is awful. It says all too clearly, you're walking on 2,400 years of trash. This could not be more wrong. And as an academic, right, I can use some of the jargon and talk about colonial understandings, because that just isn't what it is. When I think about the mounds, they are incredible engineering feats. That to take shell, and when you think about some of these mounds, it's a tremendous amount. It's not just what my kids would pick up when we go to the beach. And to stack shells, well, when I do it, it kind of falls apart right away. They not only lasted for the time periods they were used by the ancient people, but since the time the Spanish came 500 years ago, they really haven't been used, haven't been maintained by anyone in any particular way. Historic Spanish Point does not do a good job with it. They, again, muffle what's there. Yet, they don't erode. They actually stay fairly in good shape. I'll contrast it to the celery fields kind of hill, which I go to often. There's erosion all the time. Right? It's just constant. But yet these mounds, no one's maintaining them for centuries. They're engineering feats. When Indian Mound Park has a sign that's trash, it's so insulting. It's so wrong. And it's one of the reasons people don't get excited by this history, because I don't get excited by garbage. You shouldn't either. But to understand it as engineering feats, that's something. At Polson Point Mounds, Indian Mound Park as it's known, a tremendous ceremonial center was there. Up and down the coast, we find these were both places that people lived on for the cool breezes, for the good sight lines, to get away from mosquitoes, to avoid high tides and flooding during hurricanes, fire breaks for the fires that broke out, and also a place that people gathered for festivals on various annual events. They were tremendously meaningful with the expansion of the Native American Graves Protection Act, again, just last January. They clearly have the ritual ceremonial aspects that make it important under federal law, right? Again, I want to always say this is not, in my opinion, it's not just me being an academic, kind of putting forward intellectual concerns. It's legal concerns that there's a vast responsibility, not just to kind of say a few words about it, and not just to avoid the kind of colonial understandings, but to actually be respectful to these places. And they're wonderful to explore in the sense of walking where you're supposed to walk. I can think up on the north side of the Manatee River. Manatee County has a preserve, Emerson Point Preserve, that has a mound complex that has a temple mound and flanked by two other mounds, one in the shape of a bird and one in the shape of a snake. And there's a staircase and platform, so you can walk up the mound, Right? You shouldn't just climb on it, but you can walk up on it, and you can walk around the pathways. The snake mound is pretty obvious when you walk around it. The bird one's a little harder to kind of recognize because we've made the decision. It's both the scholarly world and the kind of preservation community. Let trees grow on these mounds. Let them just kind of not be just exposed, and so it's a little harder to see it. But that was a 3-mound complex that created a water court. So people would sail the canoe into a courtyard that's now been filled in, and they used the waters to go up and down the coast. We have canoes that go back thousands of years. That technology was refined. We know that some of them had sails, so they could go long distances. And so people would go between these different mounds, between these villages, these ceremonial centers, and do what people do, right? Have festivals, share information, find mates, share resources. And it was a whole world. The mounds aren't silent. We're just not listening at all. I think if you start listening and appreciating them, this history really opens up in fantastic ways.
I'd like to reintroduce our guest today. He is Dr. Uzi Baram, and he practices public archaeology through a new LLC that he is president of. And you are listening to WSLR LP 96.5 FM in Sarasota. If you would like to call and ask Dr. Baram a question, you can call 941-954-8636. That's 941-954-8636.
So we're halfway through the show. We probably need to get to the Spanish and the entrada and the effects of Europeans on the native community.
Go ahead.
Oh, good. Okay, thank you for that. So yeah, it's kind of at the halfway point. Let's kind of go back and realize there's still too many myths and misunderstandings that you can find all too readily. And again, they muffle the understanding. I think some of the museums in this community, some of the historic preservation organizations spend too much effort ignoring the Indigenous history. There's several places where the historic buildings are either on top of mounds or right next to important ancient remains, and the focus is on the kind of European American history, when what's under the feet is actually tremendously important. And it comes about from really misunderstanding. The arrival of the Spanish, starting in kind of famously Ponce de Leon in 1513, was a watershed moment. We can't ignore it. We can't tell the history without recognizing the shattered zones that were created by not that moment, but the couple of centuries of effort that some say even continue on to change the trajectory of this land. We don't really even have a better name for this peninsula except the one that Ponce de Leon gave us, right? It's Florida. The two federally recognized tribes have Florida in their names, that we just have to recognize that so much changed because of Spanish colonialism, and that we're trying to piece together what had been there before. The arrival of the Spanish, Ponce de Leon again famously comes. He starts exploring the East Coast, claiming it for Spain. He comes to Charlotte Harbor. The Clusa are ready for him, and an arrow pierces his thigh, and he ultimately dies from it. The Clusa were a political entity that covered a good chunk of what's now Charlotte Harbor all the way to Lake Okeechobee. An impressive polity, as well as one that built tremendous canals, had its capital on what's now known as Mound Key, where it had a house, a council house, where 1,000 people could stay together, right? So big is what you need to really think. Yes.
And Mound Key is in Estero Bay.
In Estero Bay, yes, to our south. The Clusa did not come up to where we are in Sarasota County. To our north was the Tocumbaga in Tampa Bay, and they came down just about to the Manatee River. So we very much are in between the Clusa and the Tocumbaga. People didn't want to pay tribute to either one of those polities. And so we have a way of life that as the Spanish continue to come, in 1539, Hernando de Soto comes with 400 of his soldiers, horses, pigs, war dogs, to look for gold and silver. And it's devastating. For 4 years, marching around what's now the U.S. Southeast in battle after battle after battle, both the death and destruction from the battles, but also the diseases that were brought in. And people had to make sense of that world. The Calusa were able to be sustained as a polity, right? So we start with 1513, we go into the 1700s. So 2 centuries, right? We don't want to erase that. That's a long time to continue a way of life. But at one point, Spanish colonialism really kind of sets in. Many of the people decide, not all, some stay in this part of the area, but move to the missions. That's a chain of villages in the northern part of Florida, accept Catholicism, accept that way of life. But in the battles between Spain and Britain, many are attacked. One of the most famous is in what's now Tallahassee, Mission San Luis. And the British in 1704, with their Native American allies, destroyed Mission San Luis. And the survivors moved west into what's now Louisiana. In that shatter zone, in all that borderland activity between Europeans fighting and all other sorts of disruptions that were occurring, many of the indigenous people moved northward into the hills of Georgia and Alabama, where they felt they could live in safety. And then 1 to 2 generations afterwards came back. And they came back with the name Seminoles. And so we think about that Spanish period that goes from 1513 to 1763 as just a tremendous turmoil where the people had to make sense of what do you do? How do you live with this European colonialism? Many resisted it, some were accommodating, some joined in, right? Many, many different choices individuals made. In hindsight, we can make our evaluations, but in the time, incredibly difficult choices. In 1763, Britain took over Florida and started expanding plantations. And we start hearing about the Seminoles in the British records. One of the things the British were always really good about as colonialists, good maps, good records. And so that's when we start seeing the maps, including the famous Romans map that includes Sarasota on it. So that's where one of the places we first see this name for this area. No explanation of why it's named that. It just kind of appears on the map.
Well, so something just came to my attention recently is that when the Spanish got to Florida and started colonizing it, a lot of what they were seeing was old hat. They'd been through Mexico, they'd been through South America, they'd been through the Caribbean, and so all these plants were things they were kind of bored with. But when the English, to the French to some extent, but when the English got to Florida and started coming down the peninsula, they were seeing stuff they'd never seen before. And so it's these English naturalists and explorers that really start documenting things in a way that wasn't part of the operating principles of the Spanish at that time. So there's a lot of information that was lost between the shattering of the cultures and then not having enough transfer of information. If we could know what the Calusa understood about this region, we'd be much better off. But most all that knowledge is probably gone. So
well, a lot of it's gone, but it's not lost. I mean, I think this again is where the history doesn't get any better, which is sad, but the reality, right? I'm again as a scholar, I believe we just look at the history and we understand it in its own time. The Spanish colonialism shifted life tremendously. The British had its own influences and transformations. What really changed for the indigenous people, for the ancestral Seminole, was when the United States took over Florida in 1821. Because what is known as 3 different Seminole Wars for the U.S. military, the First Seminole War, Second Seminole War, Third Seminole, is known by the Seminoles as the long 19th century war. Right? For them, it wasn't any different. And what we find, and it's quite clear, U.S. military forces push the Seminoles south, and south. It's part of the Trail of Tears, where hundreds were sent to Tampa Bay and then put on boats to New Orleans and then up the Mississippi, ultimately to Indian Territory. That was going to be for them forever, and now is Oklahoma. But others stayed and resisted. And by the time you get to the Third Seminole War, by the time you get to the late 1800s, it's a few hundred people living deep south in what's now the Everglades. But they've lost so many family members. There's so many people, so many elders who were lost in that. But they still remember some aspects. And I'm always respectful with what the Seminole Tribe of Florida shares internally, what it shares with scholars, what it shares with the public. And in this wonderful world of social media, several months ago on Instagram, the Seminole Tribe of Florida's Tribal Historic Preservation Office, which has an Instagram page, of course, noted that the Calusa entered the Seminole Tribe as the Bear Clan.
Oh.
So there are members today of the registered Calusa, as well as Miccosukee and the Independent Seminoles, but in the Seminole Tribe of Florida, Bear Clan who trace their ancestry to the Calusa. And they do have ancestral knowledge. They are figuring it out. I think one of the things that I front when I think about this history for the Seminole Tribe of Florida, when I try to explain it to the public, and I know there's a lot of people who don't like hearing me talk about these wars and the destruction, right? Because it was, I understand the kind of using contemporary words that in the past, but if we use contemporary words, this is ethnic cleansing, this is genocide, right? These are words that actually are appropriate to use. Understanding it wasn't used at the time, but it's a post hoc examination. The loss of so many people, the stress of it all. So I've always fronted my own heritage. I don't hide the fact I'm a person of faith. I'm Jewish. I was born in Israel to family members, several generations in that land. And my family members have lost a lot of information as well. But particularly when I'm in that ancestral land, I see things, I remember things. And the Seminole tribe, yes, it's hard to remember. There's so many layers, but it's being remembered. It's being organized. And what I encourage any audience is not to listen so much to me. I'm just the heritage interpreter who shares some of this information in various ways. Since 1997, the Seminole Tribe of Florida has invested in a museum, Atatiki, on the Big Cypress Reservation, about 20 miles north of Alligator Alley. That's one of the most impressive museums in the state of Florida, and I would say even in the country. And it's where they get to tell their story. This is where tribal sovereignty plays out. And what I've told generations of students to tell them to go, and I was teaching at New College, I tell people who listen to me, take the time to go, because it is an out-of-the-way location. When I visit, which is fairly often, there's usually not big crowds there. It's hard to get to. Staff members are so engaging. They want to share. And most of the staff members are tribal members. And so they'll give the nuances, the textures of why things are there. And we start building up, and we get, as you said earlier, John, that knowledge about the plants and landscapes. It's being generated. It's a tremendously difficult endeavor, but it's happening. And I'm always concerned with those, again, the local knowledge, the local colonial knowledge, the museums that are refusing kind of really embrace it here, because I think people find it really interesting. And as you point out, it's really useful to know.
Well, when you get to the parking lot at Atatiki, you're in Florida, and when you step into the museum, you think you could be on the mall in Washington in one of the big high-end museums in D.C.
Let me actually correct you. I really do, John, because you usually get everything right. Let me just. You're actually not in Florida when you're on the reservation. By federal law, that's sovereign Seminole territory. And so when I go, I'm always respectful that I'm a visitor to that land. Sovereignty is tough, but it is part of federal regulations. It's their land, and so we are visitors.
It's the Florida Peninsula, but not the state of Florida.
That's it.
Okay, Thank you.
So we should say something about Angola, because it is part of this as well.
Did you want to bring something up, Jonathan?
Well, we're running out of time, but let's give Angola a shot here.
Yeah, so tell us about Angola and the Maroon community there.
So when I talk about how complicated the 19th century was for the Seminole tribe and for the indigenous people, there's another layer that's there as well. As again, knowing the history, part of the colonization of North America included African slaves, right? Enslaving Africans and bringing them to this continent. The Anglo colonies had tremendous numbers of slaves. The United States, the southern states, had slavery on a massive scale. And when this was Spanish Florida, while the Spanish allowed slavery, they ruled so weakly that people came. They started coming very early on. Because the Spanish crown realized they couldn't actually fight against the British forces. So they invited those people enslaved in the Anglo colonies to come. If they saw loyalty to the crown, the Spanish crown, and accepted Catholicism, they could live as free people. And from the late 1600s onward, Florida was known as a haven for freedom. And that just accelerated over the 1700s into the early 1800s. About 20 years ago, a community scholar decided to take what was then obscure information about a potential Maroon community. It's a notion for free people of African heritage who had liberated themselves from enslavement on the Manatee River. And we worked really hard and were able to locate the material remains from a community from the 1700s to 1821. The archaeological story is a long one, but the one I want to share is the research team very quickly worked with descendants. In 1821, when the community of Angola was destroyed, some escaped to the interior of Florida, others went to the British Bahamas. And we worked with those descendants from the British Bahamas. And since 2018, and the site is now on the Underground Railroad site from the National Park Service, so recognized that the archaeological evidence is accurate. There's been a Back to Angola festival where the descendants come and celebrate the ancestors on the land where they found liberty for several decades. Mm-hmm. Angola is part of this southern route of the Underground Railroad. It's a very important story that starts at Fort Murray by St. Augustine, moves to the Apalachicola River in the Panhandle, down to Swanee River, and then here to the Manatee River. It's part of Black history. It's part of the history of freedom for this land, and it's actively being understood by the descendants. Year by year, we build in more information, because again, there's the local information that we had that referred to as escaped slave community, language I don't use anymore. There's the archaeological evidence, which I helped organize, which tells us about the time period, the things they ate, the things they used, and then most importantly, what the descendants understand of their ancestors. That really animates it, brings together all those pieces to really appreciate this very robust heritage that's represented at Reflections of Manatee, a small museum right by Manatee Mineral Springs Park, which is the little place where we excavated. You can also find some of the history at the Bishop Museum. And I just finished up a research project for the National Park Service interpreting Angola for DeSoto National Memorial. Because DeSoto National Memorial, a part of the National Park Service, has indigenous mounds that used to be there before they were removed for roadbed, but still we have a sense of those ancient people. And Angola is part of their story as well. And the park made a commitment by funding my work to connect it, and over the next, I assume, few months, a couple of years, the docents will be trained to explain Angola, this history of freedom, at the park itself, expanding the reach of what I think of as a really significant history that we can all share in.
So I have a public service announcement, and then we should talk about something else that's fraught with misunderstanding, which are chickees.
Yes.
So let me read this, and then I'm going to read a passage from my book, and Uzi can comment on it. Members of the Brady Sarasota invite allies to wear orange or white and gather at the Bayfront Park on Saturday, June 8th from 8 to 9 p.m. to pay tribute to the victims of gun violence and encourage safe firearm handling and storage. June is National Gun Violence Awareness Month, and the city of Sarasota agreed to light the Ringling Causeway orange for 3 nights starting June 8th. But Governor Ron DeSantis has decided that Florida bridges, including the Ringling Causeway, will be lighted red, white, and blue from Memorial Day to Labor Day as part of the 2024 Florida Freedom Summer effort. Brady Sarasota will provide orange glow sticks at the June 8th gathering at Bayfront Park, located at 5 Bayfront Drive in downtown Sarasota. More information is available at Brady Sarasota on Facebook. So what I'm going to read is from my book called The Palmetto Book, and it's part of a chapter dealing. I went out with a crew to harvest palm fronds, cabbage palm fronds, to build structures. And I'm not going to say more about the structures till we get there. So this is a discussion, starts with some of the problems that the team has to face. And I was working with a guy named Jose. In addition to rattlesnakes and wasps, Jose has to contend with fire ants, which are common in the prairie pastures but rare in the hammock. Falling is always a risk, but the biggest threat is making a mistake with a machete. He tells me of a man who nearly cut his hand off and had to be evacuated, who's now working again. When I tell them that palm trimmers in suburbia use chainsaws, he looks at me in disbelief. He can't imagine using a heavy chainsaw instead of a machete. Apart from the whacking, the hammock is very quiet, dampening the sounds of the crews and the meadowlarks in the pasture. I shudder imagining what 4 chainsaws would sound like. Domingo, Joaquin, and Sebastian, the driver whom they call the chief, have focused on another nearby hammock about 500 feet away. And their technique is evidently less ladder dependent, since they have only 2 ladders for the 3 of them. They focus more on palms with canopies within reach of the ground. And Jose explains that they live in Immokalee, while he lives in LaBelle. All 4 are Mexican, and Sebastian is called the chief because he is a Mexican Indian. On more than one occasion, Sebastian has been approached by chatty Seminoles or Miccosukis who have assumed he's of Creek descent. The Mexicans find this amusing. Without my asking, Jose volunteers that he doesn't think many Seminoles are building chickees or tiki huts anymore. We agree casino money is the likely explanation and drop the subject. Cheeky book author Carrie Dilley tactfully explains, as tribal members have seen an increase in financial stability in recent years due to gaming revenue, it has become more difficult for cheeky builders to find willing laborers within the tribe. This has caused builders to look elsewhere for help, often leading them to hire non-Indians for harvesting and construction processes. Even when non-Seminoles work on the construction crews, the structure will still be considered an authentic Chickie as long as the owner of the Chickie building company is Seminole. Other legislation prevents non-Seminoles or non-Miccosukis from using the term Chickie, which contributes to the proliferation of tiki huts.
Yes. Yeah, no, and I think that, it's a good passage from a very good book. If you have not picked up John O'Miller's book, I would encourage you to do so, the Palmetto book, as it's titled. I think it raises the point that we don't want to put Native Americans in the past. I'll say I think Ringling Museum of Art did a great job last year in having an exhibit on contemporary Seminole art. Not ancient art, not old art, but contemporary art, current artists among the Seminole tribe. Right? These are people living today, and they have ancestral knowledge, and they're trying to make sense of how to do things today. And the Chickie example is a good one. Again, there's federal legislation that covers Indian crafts and arts. You can't call something Native American unless it's made by Native Americans. And so that passage kind of gets at the question, the nuances of the details if the architecture is considered. And it shouldn't just be mocked, because again, a Chickie hut called a tiki hut, right, from the Pacific, is mocking. And I think we still do some of that here, right? I think we have a lot of work to do. You mentioned earlier, I don't want us to lose it, anyone driving on the Tamiami Trail downtown will see the name becomes Mound Street. It's named Mound Street because there was a vast complex of several mounds in that area. Most were destroyed by the 1930s, but we have some of the information of what they were like. I've tried to do more research. I've been stymied myself. The street sign is there. There's folks who are capable of being responsible for that heritage, who could put up useful information about what was there, what we know what was there, and haven't been doing it. And instead, it's kind of almost, I would say, almost mocked to say, oh, yeah, we're on Mound Street. I've talked about this in that film that was made in 2023, the documentary, The Sarasota Experience. When we actually get depth of what that means, that people can appreciate that the ancient ones also enjoyed that spot. I go there often, whether it's when Embracing Our Differences has its annual display, or just to walk around in the cooler months, or to see the sunset in these harder months. We are not the first to be here. And particularly those mound complexes on what's now Mound Street is a reminder to think hard about that coastline. Right, as we started with, as Julie was nice to remind folks, we're in a crisis. Much was destroyed of this heritage more than a century ago. Development has destroyed more as more housing goes up, more construction, but now we're also facing rising sea levels. Once it's gone, it's gone. And we won't be able to imagine what was there. So our generation has a vast responsibility. And hopefully what I've conveyed as we've gone through the history from the most ancient, through the coastal settlements, through the turmoils of colonialism, to the Renaissance that's ongoing thanks to the efforts of the Seminole tribe of Florida, to really appreciate those previous generations, what's here, what we care about what's here, and what we want future generations to have. In many of my public presentations, and I'm available to give public talks, I ask a simple question: what kind of ancestors do we want to be? How do we want people 5, 6, 10 generations from now to look upon us? I can look upon the archaic period people and say, how clever to bury your dead in ponds because of concerns for rising sea levels. I can appreciate the engineering marvels of those people 2,500 years ago who built mounds for village sites that are still intact because they just were built so well. How do we want to be seen by our descendants a century, 2 centuries, 5 centuries from now? The time for that decision is today.
They'll probably be doing underwater archaeology on condo culture.
I sadly would agree. That probably would be.
Can you give us a minute or so about Fort Armistead?
So you want to do one more?
Yeah.
Yeah, so part of understanding the movement of Seminoles, and again, I like doing this when I do public talks, but also when I was teaching. When I think about the map of Florida, I'm amazed how few people think hard about why we have places called Fort Myers, Fort Pierce, Fort Lauderdale, right? I think most people think Fort Lauderdale, Spring Break, kind of 20th century. These were forts, Seminole War period forts in the 19th century, including one south of New College by the Ringling Museum of Art, where hundreds of American soldiers were. There are other forts at what's now DeSoto National Memorial, Fort Sneed, Fort Hammer now has a bridge over it in Manatee County. These were places that brought in American troops that were fighting against the Seminoles. Fort Armistead should be better known. It was an important part for the soldiers who served there, and many who died there were buried nearby. Particularly of what's known as tropical diseases at the time, malaria and the rest. It also was part of the Trail of Tears. And people, just kind of driving over the place without an appreciation of what was there. Knowing Fort Armistead, knowing some of these others, it's at our fingertips. It's just so muffled. But to really think hard about how Florida got to be and where we want it to be, and include all the peoples, particularly the indigenous people and their heritage, in understanding it, I think is hopefully something that comes out of the heritage work I do.
You've been listening to Our Changing Environment on listener-sponsored WSLR LP Radio 96.5 FM, broadcasting from our downtown Sarasota studios on Kumquat Court.
Previous shows of Our Changing Environment may be accessed on the WSLR archives. Go to archive.wslr.org.
If you'd like to be notified about upcoming shows, you can join the Facebook group Our Changing Environment.
And tune in at 9 a.m. 2 weeks from today on June 11th.